I'm the Reverend Sarah Lammert. I serve at the UUA as the co-director of Ministries and Faith Development. And I'm also the liaison to what is called the FACT survey. FACT stands for Faith Communities Today. And it is an interfaith effort that comes out of the Hartford University for Religion and Peace, which used to be called Hartford Seminary. FACT has been doing surveys for decades on religious life in the United States, and they got a special grant this year from the Lilly Foundation to do a survey about how congregations across faith traditions are doing. We sent out this survey in March and April. Many of you responded, and thank you so much for participating. We actually got 537 complete responses, which I think is a record for the UUA. And I'd like to present the data that we had, and thanks for the hard work in filling out that survey. So here we go. So as you'll see, this survey compares some data from 2018 to 2023, and in other cases just simply takes a snapshot for 2023. But what you can see in this slide is that in-person attendance, and I don't think this is a surprise for you, has declined in UU congregations actually by 25% from 2018 to 2023. And I think that's largely a result of the pandemic. The mean went from 86 to 64. But the good news is that our UU congregations pivoted really well during the pandemic. Those offering online options increased from only 7% of our congregations in 2018 to 93% in 2023. And total combined attendance, if you combine in-person and online visitors, went up from 88 to 93. So I think this is a sign of hope. And to quote the Reverend Matthew Johnson, "This is remarkable. Our fast pivot from online options, supported by the UUA and each other, means that even though there are less people physically in the church building, we are reaching more people than we did before." Here's a little snapshot of parish ministry numbers. And again, 537 congregations are represented in these numbers. 65% have one clergy person, and of those, 70% are full-time. 10% of our congregations employ more than one clergy person. 16% are fully lay-led, and the rest are in between. They are in between ministers, or they chose none of the above. Here's a quick snapshot of our UU parish ministers by gender. And this has remained relatively stable over the last 10 years. And here's what you all reported on UU parish ministers' race and ethnicity. 32% did not identify race or ethnicity on this question for some reason that I don't completely understand. So this is incomplete data. Here's a few interesting facts on longevity in UU parish ministers. So the average minister in 2023 has been in their position for 6 years, and this is a decline from 7 years in the past. 97%, fully 97% of you report a good or very good match with your minister, which is really wonderful. Since 2020, 7% of UU parish ministers, though, have seriously doubted their calling. 18% often considered leaving the parish ministry. And I think this reflects the intense stress of serving during the pandemic. That's something that I'm sure many of you who served as board presidents shared with your ministers. And finally, parish ministers rate themselves as 7.6 out of 10 on their overall health and 6.9 out of 10 on their financial health. And while this isn't terrible, I think there's room for improvement there. Here's a quick snapshot of who is participating in our UU congregations by age. We are an aging group. And here's a snapshot of UU congregational participation by race and ethnicity. And by way of comparison, I think most Protestant denominations are currently reporting that they are 80% white and 20% diverse. So we are lagging behind that just a bit over the mainline denominations.
I actually want to lift up that 10% children plus 4% youth. Actually, 14% is pretty different, maybe. I think it goes a bit counter to some of the narrative that where are the children? How we track participation has to be beyond Sunday morning. who's visible either on Zoom screens or in person. I know that a lot of religious educators adapted during the pandemic to mailing materials to families or to using
Yeah.
monthly newsletters to engage, and that some families who don't come in person really count on having that connection to spiritual resources that they get every month, whether it's a special discussion packet or activities to do at home or active in small group ministry or see each other outside. So I love that, like thinking about who we notice in different parts of congregational life rather than only who's present on Sunday mornings.
I remembered at one point, I thought we had a fairly robust youth group at the congregation I served. But then if I also counted the youth that were volunteering as teachers on Sundays or just came and sat with their parents or participated online with their parents, but didn't like going to the youth group, or those who showed up for social justice things only, it was really almost twice the number as if you just counted the youth group alone. And I think that's probably similar in most congregations.
I know that our congregations that have membership professionals, they have a person who's paid to kind of round up those numbers and get those numbers. So I think paying attention to those numbers is really helpful because they help you to tell a more accurate story. Or if it's just your perception of Sunday morning, sometimes that doesn't really reflect the whole story of congregational life.
This survey, unfortunately, didn't ask a lot of questions about religious education or music professionals. It's a survey instrument that's created by FACT, and we have to be able to compare with all the other groups. And so I think they have a different emphasis for different surveys, but I did notice there weren't very many questions in that area.
The number of non-white members in our congregation, from what I remember, that has gone up in the
I
past
think it has.
years. And I think a lot of that has to do with our work on the eighth principle and dismantling white supremacy in our congregations, taking on some of the widening the circle of concern suggestions and things like that. And also providing support like Taproot, which is a program that Sana started to help provide support. We've got the Black Lives of UU group. So there's ways that we're supporting our members of color institutionally in ways that hopefully is life-giving and sustainable and builds resilience and care and nurtures folks as part of our congregations.
I've also been seeing a lay leadership trend in some congregations of just thinking about how do we become ready to welcome people who come through the doors or who are coming back after some absence from the pandemic, and some teams who have been participating in trainings and welcoming, or other teams who have been pulling together a wide diversity of their existing voices and thinking through how can we be a welcoming congregation for all to participate, and especially folks who have found themselves more on the margins of UU congregational life in the past. And Sarah, when you were saying like taking a pause, taking a breath, we're tired, I was thinking about just how many times congregational life staff have said it's okay to do a little less church and to focus a little more on how we're coming together and how we're doing these things. So like thinking about all the people who've been tending to relationship and thinking about how they can be in relationship and how they can widen that circle, even if they're not doing extra programming, extra book groups, extra study on that, even though that programming can be important. But if they're just coming together and thinking, how can we make little shifts in how we're already doing what's great about our congregation? I think that's pretty powerful.
Yeah, I was reflecting on that too and thinking along the lines of sometimes the Sunday morning programming, the services are amazing, but a lot of work goes into the production of it, right? And wondering how we can create spaces for spiritual nourishment that doesn't require as much. What if we were just getting together to talk about a little theme? And it could be online on a Wednesday night, right? And breaking out of that Sunday model that we still sometimes find ourselves stuck in. Spiritual nourishment doesn't require doing so much. Sometimes it's just a bit of time to be reflective together in community and allowing space to build relationship, like Lenore said. I'm also thinking about Paula Coate-Jones and the communities of community and how we care for each other in the communities that we are in. And I'm wondering about the partnerships that are also reflected in this slide, in this data. Folks are really seem to be excited still about, interfaith partnerships on the ground, and how can you get spiritual nourishment from different communities as well that you are in relationship with, so that you're not focused on putting all your labor just in in one Sunday and feeling burnout because of constantly serving. How can you find yourself served by other communities nearby too?
What you struck in me is a thought that hospitality really needs to be a central ministry of every congregation. And I remember visiting a congregation as a guest preacher one Sunday, and the ushers gathered with me. And they informed me this is something they did with their minister every week. And we said a prayer for this ministry of ushering and what it meant to someone who was coming here for the first time. We prayed for someone who was coming because they had lost a loved one. And it was just, such a intention was going into just the ushering, which we think of as a kind of a low, it's like a one-off thing I can volunteer for here and there. But if hospitality is really a ministry of the congregation, then there's a team that really is looking at where are the entry points and how do we welcome people and maybe people who are different than the folks we've had here before, so that they don't come and visit one time and then never seen again. That's just a shift in mentality, isn't it? It doesn't take a lot to make that a ministry of the congregation because people are already volunteering for those things. This is an interesting slide to me. So these are the percentage of you who agreed to the following statements: that you have a clear mission, 73%, that you're striving to be diverse, 80%, that you're good at welcoming, 83%. But then when we get to is actively looking for new members, we only have a 68% agreement rate. How many of you agree that you're spiritually vital and alive? 72%. Many of you believe that you are up to making changes to meet new challenges, and certainly you proved that during the pandemic. That's 78%. And finally, is involved in the local community, 66%. So I note that the two lowest numbers, actively looking for new members and involved in the local community, are action items that I think we could improve. I'm not sure how we strive to be diverse without actively looking for new members, for example. I made a word cloud out of the responses around congregational concerns, and you'll see that burnout and finances are the largest concerns that were reported, but there's also a lot of concern about aging volunteers, about where youth are after the pandemic and whether we're serving them appropriately. Some of you reported membership declines and clarity of mission and whether you're getting enough pledges to sustain the ministry that you dream of in your congregation. But you also reported a lot of strengths. Vital worship was way up the list. Innovation during the pandemic, pastoral care, mission and outreach, fun, the ability to undertake transformation. Music is a high one, as well as justice ministries. These are all some vibrant aspects of our congregational life.
One of the things I noticed in congregations during the pandemic is that a lot of congregations could have guest musicians. Leah Morris was a guest musician at our congregation several times. So we had a nice diversity of music, as well as other people. Peter Mayer, other like big names could easily zoom in for a service. So I think that's something that might have been part of that music excitement.
Well, I think we owe a huge debt to our professional musicians in our congregations, because I think a lot of them ended up becoming informally the tech support system for creating entirely new ways of presenting music online. I really think they deserve the greatest appreciation for their work during the pandemic.
I just want to celebrate our intense adaptation and change over the past several years. I think that really came through in the survey. And I am also curious about that impact that's had on staff and leaders. I noticed that some of the challenges that people were naming in that first word cloud, there were also a lot of antidotes to those same challenges in the second one of what people wanted to celebrate. So burnout, and then spiritual nourishment, difficulty adapting, and then transformation. So seems like we have a lot of the answers within us or available to us, and yet it's sometimes hard to access those.
We're going to compare here congregational programs in person, and then the percentage that are offering these now also online or in a hybrid fashion. So 70% of our congregations that responded to the survey still have a Sunday school in person. Adult RE only 25%, and youth group just under 50%. Justice advocacy and community services, the majority of you are doing something in one of those two areas in person. And local faith-based organizing is also a very high percentage here, as well as fellowship events. Online or hybrid, only 7% are doing a Sunday school for all ages, online or hybrid, but 44% of you are offering adult RE programs online. Youth groups, only 6%, and same for young adult groups. Justice advocacy was the same percentage as in person, 41%. Fellowship events, only 32% are online or hybrid.
It sounded like, Sarah, that we're reaching more people than we were before, even though attendance in person has declined. And so I'm curious, like that brings up a question for me about how congregations should be even measuring engagement these days beyond what leaders can see on Sunday mornings.
It's a good question. I would hope that people are, when they're doing their counts, they're counting, because you can easily see how many households are tuned in. And obviously they have been, or they wouldn't have been able to answer those questions.
The numbers of people who are engaged or participating in congregations, we had 10% of children, and then we also had a large group of 65 plus. And then I also noticed, like, on how people are engaging online, there were a lot of adult RE and like senior programming. The online version is really strong. So there's something about, I know we have a lot of seniors who don't drive at night, or if you live in a northern climate, you don't want to go out when it's icy. And so, or even if you're a family, right? You know, like it's kind of nice to have the Zoom option. If you can't get the kids out the door on a Sunday morning, people can still feel connected. So I think there's kind of another layer of story that we see in the numbers when we compare the different charts of participation.
Well, I think anecdotally, though, maybe the reason the numbers are so small for children and youth programming online is that children and youth were burned out by the amount of time they were having to spend online during the pandemic. Because 6%, I think, said they were doing anything as a hybrid for Sunday school, and about the same for youth groups, which kind of surprised me, actually. Did that surprise you all? Or is that something you already understood from your view? Our congregations are making good use of technology. Fully 93% of you are using email. Most congregations are offering their newsletters as an e-newsletter online rather than mailing out paper copies these days. Texting, only 28% of you are using that regularly for the ongoing life of the congregation. Since the younger generations tend to use texting, that may be a direction to move into. ACH means that you have an electric way of transferring funds. Fully 63% of you are doing that now. Many of you are making use of social media. 63% are doing video projection in their congregations, which is wonderful. Online audio, website, and Facebook. And this is how you're spending your money that you have. 53% on staff and 26% on your buildings, with the remainder being for programs, your UUA dues, benevolence, and any other miscellaneous expenses. And this tracks with spending at the UUA in terms of the percentage spent on staff specifically. Now, financial health 2018 versus 2023, I don't think this is a huge surprise, but it is of concern that our congregations that are in serious financial difficulty went from 1.4% to 4.4% in 2023. And the number for in some difficulty grew even further from 7% to over 17.5%. Tight but we managed remained about even. Those reporting good finances, well, it's a significant decline. And those in excellent financial shape continue to be in excellent financial shape. I suspect that these are congregations with endowments that are fairly significant. I'm also curious what you all are seeing around the budget numbers and the stresses and strains there, and what the impact of that anxiety is on the system overall.
I can definitely speak to the financial pressures, but our Central East region recently did a webinar called Money Connect, where we talked about some of these financial pressures. And we're seeing like a generational shift. There's a lot more wealth that's in the baby boomer and silent generation. We're seeing the effect of that. So as people are moving away, maybe being closer to children, going into assisted living or passing away, those pledges, which are the high pledges, which are usually in the upper quartile, the 25% of your budget, how many people are providing that 25%? If you have a dozen people and one, disappears, you can weather that. But if you have 4 or 5 people and you lose, that's like 5-8% of your budget. So we're seeing the impact of that. And even if a congregation is growing, young families, just don't have the same they never have in the past, but it's worse now because a lot of young families, they haven't been able to buy houses, they have debt from student loans, all sorts of pressures in that way. So we're seeing a lot of that. So the congregations that have endowments are able to use the endowment to even out the budget in anticipation of it eventually finding its new normal.
I think one thing I left reflecting on from that webinar was also how we can think about giving in different ways when it comes to the younger generation and young adults who may not have as much monetary gifts to give, but can give in other ways, right? So how are they giving in terms of the volunteerism they're doing or the ways that they're participating in different programming, and how can that be reflected on, but also ease anxiety in the ways that we think about giving and budgets.
I think there's a piece that comes up for me about how do we have a forward-thinking investment strategy in the growth of the congregation, which includes an investment in children and youth.
Yes.
So that religious education piece really comes up for me as a wondering about. I know that there's been a lot of stress in congregations among religious educators, among lay religious educators about how to keep investing in children and youth, especially when they're not necessarily the most visible part of a congregation's life, but is so important to a growth strategy for the future. So I'm wondering if we've been noticing any creative, forward-thinking investments in that new membership, that actively looking for new members question, that striving to be diverse question, or that children and youth piece. Are there stories that we want to lift up from congregations that have been able to make tight budgets work for continuing to invest in that outreach and in welcoming new people?
This may be a startling slide to see. We experienced as a community a lot of conflict during the pandemic. No was only 13%. Yes, but not serious, 33.5%. But look at all the answers for yes and people left, yes and people withheld pledges, and yes and clergy leader left. That's a significant percentage of our congregations that were grappling with very serious conflict during the pandemic. And just a reminder that you can reach out to your congregational life staff when there are conflicts, because conflicts can be a source of creative change, but they can also be a source of a lot of pain. Interestingly, though, destructive tensions surrounding social and political issues actually declined during the pandemic. So you can see those numbers here, very high, 2.8% went down to 1.4%. Moderately high remained about even at around 6%. Average went down from 26.7 to 24.6. Relatively low increased, and non-existent stayed about the same. I'll be very interested to see how this compares with our interfaith partners when the full fact survey comes out next August of 2023.
Yeah, I was also struck by the amount of congregations that have dealt with conflicts during the pandemic and ongoing conflicts, and really grateful for the Hope for Us program now that some of these congregations are able to access and find support from, along with, ourselves as well as congregational life staff. I'm wondering if there's a correlation between that sense of conflict and what was mentioned in the congregational concerns as resistance, whether that's resistance that they're experiencing internally or externally with the things that are happening for some of our congregations, feeling unsafe in the communities that they are in. Just reflecting on that and how we can support them more in that area of conflict and safety.
And wasn't that a stunning number? 97% are either very happy or happy with their ministers currently. And we don't have a comparison for 2018 and these numbers, but I'm seeing a reduction in congregational conflicts right now. I only have my one perspective, but we're seeing a lot less complaints coming in through the misconduct process right now. I'm seeing less negotiated resignations this spring than I can remember any year I've served at the UUA, which is 13 years now. And I just wonder if we hit a peak during the pandemic when we were forced to be apart from one another, and whether things are improving as we are able to emerge from that. I'm curious what you're seeing from congregational life, if that sense is the same, or if that is just my wanting to see through rose-tinted glasses.
I hope it gives you a sense of you're not alone when it comes to conflict, that a lot of folks have struggled with it, and it seems like a lot of congregations have emerged with a more positive outlook in the future, for the future, and where they're headed. So that sense of community outlook is important for folks to ground themselves in for resilience. So
here's where I see our persistent optimism about the future. When asked about your current outlook on the future, only 0.6% of you said you felt very negative, 10% somewhat negative, 8.6% neither negative nor positive, while 42.9% felt somewhat positive and 37.9% replied very positive about the future. Our congregation is emerging from the pandemic stronger than before. Only 2.9% strongly disagree, 8.7% disagree, and 13.9% somewhat disagree. So the vast majority of you answered either neither agree nor disagree, somewhat agree, or strongly agree. Again, a lot of optimism about the future. As a result of the pandemic, we are thinking in new ways about our mission. Again, the bulk of you answered neither agree nor disagree, somewhat agree, or strongly agree. Sometimes great challenge requires great creative breakthrough in thinking.
I think there might have been a shakeout that's been happening the past few years, where the situations where there was latent conflict, it really bubbled up. But when you look at some of the data, the outlook for the future is positive. There seems to be more focus. We've spent the last 10 plus years in congregational life telling our congregations, be sure you're clear on your mission, work on your covenant, all those aspects that help make a congregation a congregation. I think some of that was part of the resilience that our congregations had. They might have had conflict, but they had that core self-understanding about mission and covenant and vision of what they want to be in the future, that they were able to move through a lot of that. The mission thing is super, super important. And I think we have some congregations that haven't done that work, and what you're sort of seeing the difference of how they got through it. And then there's there's some work that everyone else has been doing and we never got around to. Maybe it's time to work on the mission. Maybe it's time to work on the covenant. And so congregational life is working on resources to help our congregations do that. We're always able to coach, but we want to be able to offer additional resources for congregations who really want to focus. Organizations only thrive when they have a self-awareness and they have intentionality as a group. And they're really starting to understand that and how important that is. And so I think that we're seeing that trend. And I think we're seeing that in the optimism numbers that we're seeing. I mean, I was also a little bit surprised about that. That was really gave me a lot of hope, because our congregations are feeling hope.
And this is the final slide. This congregation has identified and embraced new opportunities for ministry since the pandemic. 35.6% of you agreed, 35.6% agreed, 16.8% strongly agreed, and very few disagreed with that statement. Yeah, amen to that. I think all the creativity we poured into shifting to online offerings during the pandemic and staying connected to each other and just surviving, that's the kind of energy we need to now deploy at some point for new thinking around how we serve people of all ages and what it means to have shared ministry. I mean, this is a real moment, I think, to go deeper on that, because we saw that we needed all of our leaders during the pandemic. Maybe the PPP loans and things like that helped us to maintain a certain staffing level. And then partnerships with lay leaders were also strong, even though we saw all the conflict as well. We also saw how much people accomplished during that time. And I think people are just a little like in a moment of just like catching their breath maybe and a little bit tired, especially as this is like May right now, so we're recording this. And for many, that's like a time in the year when things kind of go a little bit less in, at a full tilt in congregational life starting for the summer. But hopefully when we have that chance to refresh ourselves and take a breath, we'll really turn our minds to exactly what you're lifting up, Lenore. Recently, I was invited to preach for a celebration of a 20-year ministry. Not many of our ministers stay for 20 years, and when they do, it's very exciting. I think in that particular congregation, which goes back to the 1600s, the last time they had a minister reach that milestone was in like 1786. So it had been a while since they'd had that kind of steady leadership. One of the things I asked the congregation was to focus on 3 questions as they look to the future. And I think they're simple questions that any congregation can benefit from revisiting from time to time in an intentional way. And the 3 questions are, who are we? Really, who are we? Who is our neighbor? And, whether we can extend the circle of who belongs to us by really including the neighbor. And then finally, what is love asking of us to do? What is love calling our congregation to do? And that's to lead back to the mission focus that you were talking about earlier. But those simple 3 questions can be very powerful. So who are we? Who is our neighbor? And what is love calling us to do? I think those are fun reflections.
That brings up for me a way of using this survey. Anybody who's watching this video will automatically, I think, be interested in reflection, right? And like taking a pause to notice what is and learning from that and growing from it. And my hope is that we're going to be able to do that as congregations too. So just as we're learning from our wider denomination, that congregations might take some time to sit down or move together or whatever with each other, maybe with a wide variety of people with different angles of view on congregational life, and just to kind of tell each other stories of what we've learned in adaptations over the past couple of years. Because some of what we were talking about, especially Sana, what you're thinking about, like spiritual nourishment in other ways other than Sunday morning, I think people got really good at practicing that, right? Like giving each other's phone calls, sending out at-home materials for kids, just checking in with each other, having informal check-ins, like simplifying and just focusing on what is the deep need. And I hope that we won't lose those muscles of looking at what is the deeper need here and finding really like the simplest way to meet that. I hope we can capture that in stories of like what has been working so far. So even when we're returning to some other way of doing things, we can keep those threads.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Lenore. I'm also thinking of like how can we stay connected to our BIPOC communities, right? Like, so if we have 1 or 2 folks that come in or are members, how do we connect them to the larger BIPOC community that exists in Unitarian Universalist communities? And I was also reflecting on the data around, what people are using to get information out, like emails and texting and things like that. And Drum actually has been using texting quite a bit before they've had some online public worship, and sometimes even give me a phone call, and it's a reminder that this service is going to happen this week. And that's really welcome to me because I do sometimes lose track of the things that nourish me, and that kind of a text or a phone call at the last minute can help me get focused and get online and participate. I invite folks, to think about partners like Drum, Blue, but also our online communities in the UUA. We have Taproot, but also the Central East Region BIPOC group that meets once a month as a way to connect folks who might not be feeling as connected to BIPOC communities in their area.
There's a place on the UUA website that has links to a lot of these opportunities for connection. We'll share in the text of this page.
Yeah, let's put in a link for Uplift as well. Such a vital time to have people understand that there's that ministry for all ages available.